Welcome to eGestalt's webinar titled HIPAA HITECH Compliance, How to Be Ready for an OCR Audit. Today's presenter is Anupam Sahai, co-founder and president of eGestalt. Anupam is an accomplished management, marketing, and technology leader with 21 plus years of experience directing teams to develop and launch globally renowned products generating up to $350 million annually. Prior to eGestalt, Anupam was Vice President Marketing for ICSIA Inc. He's a recognized expert in the areas of healthcare IT, cloud computing, security and compliance, networking, and is a featured speaker at several industry conferences worldwide. Usually, we don't do this, but we'd like to understand the demographics of our audience so we can tailor this webinar and future webinars. So we have 3 poll questions. So I invite all the attendees to answer these poll questions. I'm going to launch the first one right now, and you should be able to see it in your GoToWebinar admin area. And the first question is, what is your current status? The answers are covered entity, business associate, service provider, or other. And I will leave this open for 5 more seconds. Go ahead and vote. Okay, I'll close the poll. So Anupam, are you able to see the answers? I can read them off for you as well.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, great. 57% responded service providers, and 33% covered entity, and 27% business associates. Now let me launch the second poll question. What is your role at your company? Go ahead and vote. The answers are executive, compliance-related, risk privacy-related, IT-related, or other. And I'll give you 5 more seconds to vote before I close the poll. Okay, I will close the poll. And 55% of you responded IT-related, and 25 and 22% executive and compliance-related. Now the third poll, have you undergone a security risk analysis? So let me launch that. Have you undergone a security risk analysis? Yes or no? Go ahead and vote. Pretty even so far. I'll close the poll in about 5 seconds. Okay, so it's pretty even. 53% of you responded yes, and 47% no to the question, have you undergone a security risk analysis? Okay, very interesting, and thank you for participating in this poll. We're recording this presentation, or this webinar, so we're going to be posting it on eGestalt's website after the webinar, but if you'd like a copy of the presentation, please send an email directly to Anupam. He'll flash his contact information slide at the very end of the webinar. Thanks, Anupam, for presenting, and I'll turn the webinar over to you now.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning and good afternoon. So we have a number of topics that we will cover today. We will start out with HIPAA HITECH requirements, describing that, and also talk about some of the omnibus requirements that have come in earlier this year. And then we'll jump into discussing OCR audit requirements. So what is that HHS is looking for? And I'll talk about some of these acronyms so that everybody has the same vocabulary in the next slide or so. And then I'll talk about 10 best practices that are typically part of our HIPAA HITECH security and compliance plan. Now I want to clarify that not all of these are mandatory requirements, but these are best practices, so I want to distinguish between the two. But any robust security and compliance plan typically would have at least these 10 things that any business would need to do, or if you're a service provider, then you want to look out for these best practices. And then as an organization, I'll talk about some of the 9 steps that are required for being prepared for an HIPAA HITECH audit. And for whatever reason, if you do get audited, then what to do? How do you go about answering and dealing with the information that OCR would need for an audit? And in the last 10 to 15 minutes, I'll talk about AGFI Secure GRC, which is an automated tool that allows you to manage your end-to-end security and compliance management, and also automates the process of being ready for OCR audits. And also, if you do get audited, it'll have all the evidence and the documentation, etc., that you might need to show it to OCR or HHS. Before I jump into the details, let me make some standard disclaimers that information about HIPAA HITECH is continuously evolving, is subject to change, and while we made every effort to ensure that the information is correct, as things keep changing, we cannot offer any assurances. If you are looking for any legal help, then we would recommend talking to an auditor or a legal counsel for that. Excuse me. Okay. So some acronyms that we will be using during our presentation today. I mentioned HHS. It stands for Department of Health and Human Services. This is the primary agency responsible for protecting the health and provides health and human services to all Americans. OCR stands for Office of Civil Rights. It's the enforcement agency for HIPAA HITECH. PHI and EPHI essentially stands for Protected Health Information. If it's in physical form and or electronic form, we would use the terms interchangeably. And covered entity, CE stands for a covered entity, PA stands for a business associate. So let's get some definitions squared away so that we are all talking about the same thing. So a covered entity, as per the definition of HHS, is either of these instances in either of these categories. So it could be a doctor, clinician, psychologist, dentist, chiropractor, anybody who provides health care. It could be a health plan, or it could be a healthcare clearinghouse. So health information exchanges, etc., are in the purview of being a covered entity. The definition of a business associate is fairly broad. Anybody who does business with a covered entity and deals with PHI, protected health information, they are required and bound by the same regulations as the customers that they serve. So this includes IT service providers, it includes accountants, it includes legal folks, attorneys, it includes garbage collectors, it includes EMR providers. So you have it. Anybody who touches PHI information or deals with the PHI information when they interact with a covered entity is a BA. And so given that definition, so let's kind of review what are the changes that have been brought about by HITECH and most recently the HIPAA Omnibus rules. And there are some game changers here. And what HIPAA Omnibus really has done is to clarify and reinforce some of the requirements that HITECH had put together in 2009. And HIPAA Omnibus reinforces that and clarifies certain clauses. So as part of HITECH, the requirement was that covered entities, business associates, and subcontractors all can be audited by the government if they're not complying with HIPAA HITECH. And that is certainly a requirement that goes about unchanged as part of the HIPAA Omnibus. HIPAA Omnibus, HITECH also increased the fines from earlier being $100 to about $50,000 per incident up to a $1.5 million per incident category maximum. So if you have a series of incidents which are considered to be breach of HIPAA HITECH laws, then you can be fined up to $1.5 million for that category. And what HIPAA Omnibus has clarified is that there is no maximum fine. There is a maximum fine per category, but if you have multiple categories of incident of breaches, your fines could be unlimited. Now, the other game changers, as it were, are the ability for HHS to share the proceeds of the fines that are imposed with whistleblowers, and also it helps fund some of the HHS activity. So there is incentive and motivation built into the system to ensure that HHS and whistleblowers are essentially ensuring that HIPAA HITECH compliance is in place. And state auditor generals can also bring about civil actions on behalf of their citizens. Now the other two big game changers are, one is that now as part of HITECH and HIPAA Omnibus has reinforced that, is that business associates and any subcontractors who work with the business associates are legally liable along with the covered entities to protect PHI. And so BAs and subcontractors need to be HIPAA HITECH compliant along with covered entities. And finally, the data breach notification requirements have changed as well. And HIPAA Omnibus has clarified that earlier there was a risk of harm clause which has now been changed to essentially imply that any breach that happens needs to be notified by the covered entity, or if the breach happens with a business associate or a subcontractor, they need to inform the entity upstream. So BA needs to inform the covered entity, or the subcontractor needs to inform the BA, who needs to inform the covered entity, and the covered entity would need to inform HHS to ensure that reporting of breaches are done, and they have some risk analysis clause that allows you to minimize that reporting capability. So the bottom line here is that HIPAA HITECH is now expanded in scope. There are higher penalties, and there's some criminal liabilities that are now part of the HIPAA HITECH and HIPAA Omnibus rules enforcement. So in terms of who's required to implement HIPAA HITECH, clearly the covered entities, and there are about 700,000 covered entities that are in the purview of HIPAA HITECH enforcement. But there are roughly about a couple of million BAs, business associates, and subcontractors who are now required to be HIPAA HITECH compliant. And of course, the government has put together a stimulus money of $28 billion to ensure EMR implementation. And as of 2013, the Medicare providers and Medicaid providers would get some incentive money from the government to implement EMR records, which is one of the reasons for ensuring better sharing of patient records, and thereby it serves one of the goals of HIPAA HITECH to improve the quality of care, healthcare, and to reduce the cost of healthcare administration. So the question that we get asked sometimes is, why do we care? And we need to care because breaches are pervasive. And what I'm showing here are some snippets of recent breaches that have happened, some of the recent high-profile breaches that have happened. But be rest assured that even smaller businesses, smaller covered entities, and subcontractors are not unaffected. Breaches are pretty evenly spread across small to large-size businesses. And the state-level breaches that happened, Utah, Alaska, and this is the recent report which says that 21.7 million individual records have been breached since late 2009. And there is an ongoing tally that's posted by HHS, which tells us that roughly about 700 to 900 incidents happen monthly, and about 25% of them are actionable by OCR. So this is a huge problem, and breaches are very common. Attackers are becoming very organized, they're very sophisticated, and businesses typically who are not taking sufficient safeguards for protecting and securing the infrastructure are open to such attacks, and they're getting breached and attacked very frequently. HHS has this thing called a wall of shame. I know it's not a very nice hearing name, but any breaches that are reported to HHS are listed here, and this is a URL on the HHS site. And if you go there, you'll see businesses of all size essentially reporting, And this includes covered entities, business associates, everybody reports it, and they're pretty evenly spread across the board in terms of reporting breaches. And here is another view of the data. Roughly about 50% of the breaches happen because of business associates who are not HIPAA HITECH compliant, and they get breached, and thereby they pass on the liability along with themselves to the covered entities who have a shared responsibility and liability to ensure that their business associates and subcontractors are taking safeguards to implement HIPAA HITECH security and compliance regulations. So this is kind of a background. One more slide before I jump into some of the actions that we can do. So one of the key requirements for getting the federal stimulus money from the government is to show what is called meaningful use, which essentially means that the government wants to know that while the EMR, electronic medical record implementation, is happening, that the business has taken sufficient safeguards to ensure protection and privacy and security of the patient records. And that's determined by the security risk analysis clause. And roughly that takes about 70% of the time to show meaningful use. The other ones are typically prepackaged by the EMR vendors, but this is the toughie. And there's a lot of confusion about whether EMR vendors provide this or not. From our insights, they do not. And so this is an important step that's required to get meaningful use dollars. So with that background, let me change gears and kind of talk about what is that we need to protect. If you're a service provider, if you're a business, and as you will see, the definition of protected information and what needs to be protected and how it needs to be protected as per HIPAA HITECH guidelines is pretty comprehensive. So PHI could be in physical form, it could be in electronic form. And PHI pertains to information that relates to a particular individual. It could be past, present, or future personal information. It could be health-related information, or it could be anything that could lead up to a particular individual. All of that is considered and construed to be PHI, and it needs to be protected. And the HIPAA HITECH privacy and security rule essentially mandates 4 different categories of requirements. There are a set of administrative procedures, which are around policies, procedures, and trainings. There is a category of physical safeguards, which are around ensuring that if the data is sitting in a particular room or on a server, it needs to be physically protected in terms of ensuring no unauthorized person accesses that room or that server. Then there are a number of technical security services and technical security mechanisms, which are essentially another way of saying IT-related services and mechanisms that ensure privacy and security of the data. And we'll talk about how do we go about putting together a security and compliance plan wrapped around these basic requirements to address and put together sort of best practices to address these requirements. So let's dive into the privacy requirements a little bit more. What the privacy requirements essentially mandate is to make the individual rights to be supreme. And what it means is that if anybody is accessing the information, if anybody is reselling the information, the patient needs to be involved. And there needs to be the patient needs to be completely in the loop, and there are limitations in terms of use and disclosure of PHI without patient authorization. So privacy is key here, and to enforce this requires a set of processes and guidelines that I'll talk about later. From the security point of view, requirements-wise, what HIPAA HITECH mandates essentially is that no matter where the PHI resides, whether it's sitting on a server, sitting on a fax machine, when it is at rest, or if it is in transit, if it's being sent over the internet, you're accessing a EMR record over the internet, or you're accessing via a mobile phone, or you're dialing in remotely using a VPN access. Any access and use of PHI information needs to be secured. And there are multiple ways of securing it, and we'll talk about that. So when HIPAA audits are done by OCR, here are some of the requirement things that they look for. They're really focused on ensuring privacy and security of data. I talked about some of the requirements earlier, and we'll talk further down the road a bit more about what shall we do and how do we go about meeting these requirements. They're looking at security requirements, and they're looking at breach notification requirements. So let's jump into how-to aspect now. So from a privacy perspective, it requires putting together a set of processes and policies which require patient approval for any sharing of information. And on the business side, it requires a set of policies to ensure that only the right people have access to the information, and they get to see a limited data set based on their requirements. So they shouldn't see everything. And to ensure that the right person is accessing the information, there needs to be something called a multi-factor authentication, which is another way of saying that just having a simple username password is not good enough. There needs to be a supplemental source of authentication. Could be biometric, could be another PIN or something. So think about banks, financial transactions that you do, which typically uses multi-factor authentication. So the intention here is to limit the use of the data and limit access of data and ensure the patient is completely agreeing to whatever information is shared. So it results in a set of forms and processes that implement this. So what do we do on the security and compliance side? And how do we ensure that we meet the HIPAA audit requirements and ensure privacy and security of the PHI information to deal with the covered entities and also business associates and their subcontractors? So I'll talk about 10 best practices that typically form part of a security and compliance plan. And then I'll talk about 9 things that a business needs to do as they implement a security and compliance plan that forms a part of that. So the first step that a business needs to do is to understand where do they stand today with respect to what the HIPAA HITECH compliance requirements are, security and compliance requirements are. That involves doing a self-assessment and then doing a gap analysis, which essentially means that you know what's missing. And the risk analysis tells you the importance of what things are missing. So risk analysis is key to understanding which action items to prioritize over the others. And then making sure that there's accountability, there's ownership in the organization to ensure follow-up and closing of all these gaps and risks that are found. And by the way, this is also required, the security risk analysis is also required for getting the federal stimulus money that I talked about, for showing EMR meaningful use, which is required for getting the stimulus money. Second thing is to, once you've understood the gaps from a compliance perspective, it's also important to know where are the vulnerabilities. Given your IT assets, given your IT infrastructure, what are the misconfigurations? What are the vulnerabilities that your assets have? Are there default passwords sitting in your router that somebody can breach into? So understanding the vulnerability and the threat landscape, understanding the configuration and policy issues with respect to all the IT assets will minimize breaches, will also ensure compliance with the HIPAA HITECH laws. And again, this is Number 1 and number 2 are required for showing meaningful use, which requires that you look at the threats and also look at the security and compliance issues in your infrastructure. So once you have these two, you are in business with respect to showing meaningful use, but also managing the threats and compliance related issues. Third best practice is encryption. While I want to make sure that encryption is considered to be optional by the HIPAA HITECH law, but it's optional because if you have another way of protecting data, then that's fine. It involves a lot of physical safeguards, etc. You can do without encryption, but encryption might be the easiest way to go about this, where you're ensuring that any information, PHI information that's stored at rest in your laptops, in your servers, in the sky is encrypted. And in fact, in stage 2, requires that all EMR vendors use encryption for storing and transmitting the PHI information as well. And if any information is sent via email or through social networking sites, that should be prevented. There should be policies around that. And this becomes a critical part of managing PHI information flow and potential leakage. I talked about as a part of HITECH and HIPAA Omnibus that managing vendors, whether it's business associates or subcontractors, is key to ensuring HIPAA HITECH compliance. So it's incumbent upon the covered entities to ensure that when they deal with their business associates, when they deal with their accountants, lawyers, or even garbage collectors, they are putting together an agreement that allows them information, complete flexibility and information about what the BA and the subcontractor is doing to deal with the HIPAA HITECH and PHI management issues. And in some cases, we have covered entities going a bit further than that and saying that I would like to review and do an audit maybe every 6 months of every BA and subcontractors that they work with. So depending on the leverage that the covered entity has, it can go from a loosely coupled agreement to a more closer review option. Using of cloud and SaaS-based services, again through market research, have shown to be more secure compared to businesses spending all the money to ensuring security and safety of data, especially for SMBs where they may not have the IT resources or the cash or wherewithal to ensure complete security. And again, research out there from a number of reputed market research companies tell us that folks like Amazon or Rackspace, they take a lot of security and compliance precautions to ensure protection of data. I talked about using multi-factor authentication, and what this means is that anybody who's accessing PHI, we need to ensure 2 levels of authentication. Username password is good, but add another level, maybe using PIN, using biometric data or fingerprint, in addition to the username password is required. And again, this is to ensure that only the right people access the information or change the information or share the information to protect leakage and misuse of PHI. Social media policy, as we know, is Facebook, Twitter is pretty commonplace, and there have been a number of breaches of recently that have happened as a result of accidental disclosure of patient records on a Facebook forum or on a LinkedIn forum. So putting together a social media policy that educates employees and provides them with guidance with respect to what can they share, what they cannot share in a public forum becomes very key. And social media policy is coming up to be a major requirement. Disposal of PHI. Now, PHI can be a physical form, whether you're talking about physical files with patient information, or it could be electronic form. And the PHI information could be stored on tapes and storage media. So disposal of PHI information or EPHI information needs to be managed, and it needs to be managed as in the PHI information needs to be disposed of, and the guidance from HHS on how the disposal needs to happen. But suffice it to say that this is critical patient information that needs to be managed. And finally, ensuring that accidental or intentional misuse of data doesn't happen. And again, there are multiple ways to do that. There are multiple ways to implement what is called policy-based access. So for example, there could be a policy which says marketing may not have access to the CFO's data, or any finance guys may not have access to certain kinds of data. It could be a function of the level of the organization, etc. Data leak protection is another technology that allows you to implement some of that. And again, there are multiple ways to do this, but ensuring that if there is a disgruntled employee or if there is an accidental disclosure, it doesn't happen unless they go through some hoops to share the information or to steal the information. So those were the 10 best practices that we believe form part of an effective compliance and security plan. So in order for somebody to be prepared for an OCR audit, let's recap. What do we need to do? Firstly, we need to understand all the requirements that I talked about. There are privacy requirements, there are security requirements, there are liability issues in terms of who can share information with what, and all of that needs to be understood. Given the recent disclosure of HIPAA Omnibus and HITECH, so all of that needs to be understood. And then there's need to formulate a security and compliance plan. I talked about the 10 best steps, 10 best practices that typically form part of a security and compliance plan. Now you could have a more additional set of items there, but at least those 10 steps are sometimes required. And then making sure that there are people assigned roles-wise. There's the compliance role, there's the risk role, and maybe it's the same person playing different roles. But all these activities need to be managed. The security and compliance activities need to be managed. They need to be assigned ownership, and some of it involves educating and training employees across the company. Starting out with doing a self-assessment and gap analysis regularly. So you start out by calibrating where does the organization stand today vis-a-vis the overall requirements, and maybe you take steps to bridge it, but guess what? In 3 months or 6 months down the road, that would change. New employees would come in, new assets would come in, and things would change. So it's important to do the analysis, do the self-assessment regularly. And depending on the regulations, it varies. PCI, for example, requires a quarterly kind of a assessment. HIPAA, we recommend 6 months. Some people do it more frequently. And then implementing asset vulnerability management to ensure that no breaches are being exposed, and managing the threat landscape, the vulnerability landscape is very important. And to combine this all, there needs to be a regular security and risk analysis done, which essentially is another way of saying that you are looking at the current security and risk status of the organization by looking at compliance issues, by looking at vulnerability issues, looking at threat issues. So it's a summary of your security and compliance posture for the organization. And then ensuring that policies, procedures are put in place. There should be a breach notification plan. If for whatever reason a breach does happen, how does the organization react? And who is responsible for ensuring a timely response, to provide a timely response to the breach, for example. And so there needs to be disciplinary procedures, there needs to be rewards and reward structure in place. And at the end of it all, you have to have a proof of compliance, which typically is a single document that tells anybody and yourself what are the steps that the organization has done to ensure compliance with HIPAA HITECH, and it's a summary of all the steps and all the procedures that have taken place. So these are the 9 steps that allow an organization to be prepared for an audit. And if an audit does happen, guess what? You're ready. And typically what an OCR audit request would be that they would send out an email or a letter saying, these are the things that I would like to look into. And they would typically look for an attestation of compliance. They would look for a list of policies and procedures and evidence that the staff is complying with them. They want to look at the breach response plan. They want to look at how you're protecting the PHI information. If you're not using encryption, what else are you using to safeguard the information? So all the things that I talked about typically would be covered if an OCR auditor comes by knocking. And so you'll be prepared if you have done the homework, taken the steps to safeguard and put together a security and compliance plan, followed by implementing and ownerships and organization-wide things that I talked about earlier. So having said that, given that background, let's talk about what can we do and what are the ways to solve the problem now that we know what's the nature of things that we need to do. So unfortunately, the solutions today are very expensive. They're very labor intensive. The number of compliance products that are out there which require a lot of customization. So we've designed AG-FI and Secure GRC from the ground up to deal with HIPAA HITECH compliance issues. And it's essentially a completely cloud-based solution, doesn't require any hardware, completely software-based solution that has support for built-in frameworks. It has HIPAA HITECH certainly, but other frameworks like PCI, SOX, FISMA are built in. It's got built-in vulnerability management tool, again, completely through the cloud, first of a kind. It's has been praised by the analysts for being very automated. And it allows you to do complete security risk analysis. There's a vendor management module service that's built into it, which allows you to manage business associates and subcontractors. And it comes prepackaged with a set of best practices, policy and procedure documents that you can customize to your needs. And all of this is made very cost effective because we don't have any hardware, unlike some of the other players that you might have talked to. And it's very HIPAA HITECH domain specific with all the knowledge that we've gathered from dealing with the healthcare vertical. And it deals with the complete workflow that I talked about. Doing an assessment, figuring out gap analysis, and then putting together a training plan, best practices, policy templates, a vulnerability scanning. All of that is integrated into the workflow of the tool that will guide you through the process and allow you to, at the end of it all, come up with a report on security and compliance, which becomes your proof of compliance after the whole process. And then you can schedule this process to repeat every 3 months, 6 months, whatever have you. There are multiple editions of the product depending on the size of the business. We certainly assume that smaller businesses have a different scope of requirements versus the bigger editions. So we have different editions that suit that. And the same solution scales up from single doctor offices all the way to large tertiary hospitals, county hospitals. So we have deployments across the board that allows us to scale up. So I want to give you a quick flavor of the tool before wrapping it up for Q&A. This is what the dashboard looks like when you subscribe to the tool. It will automatically do a scan of the network, tell you what your security and compliance posture is. Essentially, it does a gap analysis on the fly. And by the way, you can download a diagnostic tool, a free community version from egistol.com to get a flavor for it. And once you do that, it will scan the network and tell you your security posture and compliance posture. And then once you know that, it will also guide you through how to fix it. That's the paid version. The free version will tell you what the issues are. This is part of the tool. So we basically, the way the tool works is that we ask a simple yes or no questions. And these are requirements coming from HIPAA HITECH in this case. And it tells you, gives you all kinds of guidance. You can upload evidence in the tool to show that you are complying with the requirement. There are built-in policy documents that you can click on, which are associated with that particular question that you can leverage, you can customize and upload as evidence. There are templates for BA agreements, for example. What are the things that a covered entity needs to look out for, and what kind of things should they put in a business associate agreement? We'll have a sample template there which deals with all the issues that they need to worry about. And so you can customize this, augment this if you need to, and put this in place with your vendors. The tool provides you with a lot of information, a lot of research and knowledge-based information, which allows you to understand how to interpret the requirement, how to answer the yes or no question. So there's a citation guidance. There's a best practices section which tells you what are the things that typically an organization does to implement this requirement. So we provide that right in the tool, and then there is a risk model that's associated with every requirement so that you know how important that requirement is. The tool will also give you, after scanning your infrastructure, the top 10 vulnerabilities that are present in the infrastructure, and it will tell you right there with the click of a button how to go about fixing the problem. So in this case, there's some patches missing. There might be default passwords that are set that need to be changed, or there might be some misconfiguration issues or policy configuration issues that the tool will point out. So it's a completely automated tool that will guide you through all that is missing. And ultimately, at the end of it all, once you've gone through the process of fixing the problems, remediation, the tool will generate a report on compliance, which is really a real-time snapshot of your security and compliance posture. And this is a document that you can keep updating as often as you do the assessment. And it can be generated in real time. It can be shared with external auditors or internal auditors, or it could be just kept in physical form or in electronic form as a proof of compliance. Similarly, you can also use the tool to proactively manage the compliance and security posture of any vendors or business associates that you work with. So if you're a covered entity and you have these labs and these business associates that you work with, you would know using the tool what's the BA's compliance posture, what's the BA's security posture, and then you can work with the business associate to ensure that they are completely HIPAA HITECH compliant. So depending on the degree that you want to take control of your destiny, the tool will allow you to do that. If you just want to take a hands-off approach and let the business associates implement their own security and compliance policies, so be it, and the tool will allow that as well. The tool will also provide you with a sample email that a covered entity would typically send if they find that the BA is not following the HIPAA HITECH requirements. So it essentially manages the whole process for you and automates the whole process of dealing with all the requirements and headaches, if I may say, from the HIPAA HITECH perspective. So it takes care of all those issues. So that's pretty much about the tool. Let me just summarize quickly what we learned. We basically said that in order for us to be prepared for a HIPAA HITECH audit from OCR, we need to first understand where do we stand today, and then take steps to ensure that the gaps and the risks that are found are plugged. And that can be done by assigning resources and owners. And clearly we need to have a data breach response plan for whatever reason, if we do get breached, that will come in handy. And in closing, I would say that AG5 Secure GRC provides you with the completely automated way of managing your security and compliance processes and issues. And it can do the security risk analysis. It can manage your vendors for you. So if you are interested in learning more, or if you're a service provider who would like to better understand how to offer this service, please feel free to contact us. This webinar will be available online, archived, and here are my contact information. As I said, you can download a free version of the diagnostic tool from egestalt.com, and I would like to open this up for questions now. Mike?
Okay, great. Thank you, Nupam. Thanks for presenting to the attendees. We'll open it up for questions right now. And if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them in the questions area of GoToWebinar. Nupam, here's our first question. Are you saying that MFA is required or recommended?
Sorry, what MSA? Could you repeat
MFA.
that?
Yeah. Are you saying that MFA is required or recommended? Multi-factor authority?
Oh, MFA. Okay, multi-factor authentication. No, it's not required. As I said, these are best practices, but in order to ensure access control, that's one of the ways of achieving it. So multi-factor authentication is one of the many ways of doing it. And just like encryption, it's not required, but it's a best practice and will get you a very good ROI for the investment that's made. So it's a recommendation.
Great. Okay. And what are the chances that I'll get audited?
That's a good question. So the question that I would ask you is, the chances of getting audited is not very high. Just like in a tax audit, about 3 to 5% people get audited, if they don't file a tax. Similarly, the percentages are going to be lower. The last year, OCR had hired KPMG to do about 150 audits, and what I hear from the reports that I've read is that that OCR is going to be launching a permanent HIPAA HITECH audit program around September timeframe, and they haven't released the numbers in terms of how many organizations are they going to be randomly auditing. So the chances of getting audited is low, but you don't want to wait for an audit to be ready. And secondly, some of the things that are required by HIPAA HITECH are anyway a natural progression or a natural set of things that an organization needs to do to deal with security and compliance issues. So I would highly recommend that you look at the HIPAA HITECH practices. They form part of a overall security and compliance story anyway, and our best practices that should be implemented one way or the other.
Great, thanks, Nupam. What are the sales requirements for the 3 partner levels?
Yeah, so we can take it offline. Basically, we can, if you leave your number and stuff, we can talk to you about that. There are some minimum volume commitments that are pertaining to each level, and we can talk to you in detail about that.
Next question, do you have any advice for a small practice that has one person for compliance, privacy, and billing, and how to handle all these regulations?
Yeah, so the tool will provide you with a very simple, we have a number of single doctor practices who use our tool to deal with their compliance issues, and the tool will scope the requirements based on the business size. So you don't have to do all of this that I talked about if you're a small practice versus medium to large businesses who might have to do a lot of these that I talked about. So we'll take care of that. The tool will guide you with respect to what you need to do, and so please reach out to us and we can help you there.
Okay, great. What is the typical monthly cost of your service?
So we sell based on the yearly subscription. At the very entry level for 1 or 2 doctor offices, the cost could be somewhere around $1,000 per year. So that's less than $100 a month, and it goes up depending up or down, mostly up based on what modules you want to buy, and then the different size of the business would pay different pricing based on what they're trying to do. But the entry level is that much, roughly around $1,000 a year.
Does the BA agreement cover me from all liability if the BA is at fault?
It does not cover you for all the liability but it shows reasonable efforts from your perspective to deal with the issues, but then you will still have to ensure that BA is safeguarding and protecting PHI. But yeah, The fines will be lower if you have a PA agreement and it shows reasonable effort, which is a lower penalty than a willful neglect, which is if you don't do anything. And that is sometimes deemed to be criminal and in terms of prosecution ability. So yes, it helps lower the fine and lower your liability a little bit, but it doesn't absolve you from doing more.
Okay, thank you, Anupam. All right, so we have no more questions. Thank you all for the questions that you've asked. If you have any questions after the webinar, feel free to contact Anupam directly. Thank you to the attendees for attending, and Anupam, I'll leave you with the closing remarks.
Okay, thank you all for coming. Appreciate your audience, and please feel free to reach out to us if you need any additional information, and look forward to talking to you soon.
Great. Thank you, Anupam, and thank you to the attendees. Have a great day.